Annyeonghaseyo. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final day of our third Philippine Koreanist Congress. This event is made possible by our organizer, the UPKRC. So as a brief background, UPKRC was launched on April 27th, 2016, aiming to provide Filipino scholars and researchers with opportunities to widen their interest in Korean studies. UPKRC holds various academic and cultural activities for Filipino scholars and professionals and serves as a university-wide hub that will promote and develop Korean studies in the country. For more information or updates, visit www.facebook.com/UPKRC. The webinars conducted in this event include overarching theme titled Revisiting Diversity in Multiculturalism in Contemporary Korea, Trans-Border Relations and Policy Implications, and 7 research papers that are related with current affairs in the Korean Peninsula, South Korea and North Korea reunification dialogues, and portrayals of North Korea in South Korea and Philippine media. For your benefit, previous lectures can be rewatched via UPKRC YouTube channel. So now let's proceed to the very heart of our program, the lectures by Professors Paragas and Correa. For our first speaker, we have Professor Paragas. Fernando de la Cruz Paragas is a professor at the Department of Communication Research of the College of Mass Communication of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He completed his PhD degree in Mass Communication at Ohio University as a scholar of the Fulbright Program of the United States of America. Dr. Paragas earned his MA in Urban and Regional Planning, for which he received a Dean's Medallion, and BA in Communication Research, where he received the Best Undergraduate Thesis Award at UPD. Okay. Prior to returning to UPD, Dr. Paragas taught at the Wee Kim School of Communication and Information at Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. Okay. And also, Dr. Paragas was a recipient of the 2019 Gawad Chancellor sa Natatanging Guro, the highest award bestowed by UPD on its faculty members. He is also the convener of the Program on Higher Education, Research, and Policy Reform at the UP Center for Integrative Development Studies and the president of the Philippine Association of Communication and Media Research Incorporated. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, please welcome Dr. Fernando Paragas.
Hello and thank you for joining us today. Let me now present my study entitled The Man in the North, the People in the South, the Two Koreas in Philippine Online News. To start, let me give you the background of the study. In 2018, we conducted a study on how South Korea and its citizens were featured in Philippine news. We focused then on local news, whereas in this paper, I examined international news and how international news flows are produced and potentially disrupted. We found before that news stories focused more on people than on the country, with Koreans framed economically as business persons, investors, or tourists. Crime also emerged as an additional topic as the news featured Koreans either as victims of crime or perpetrators of crime. Thus, in this paper, I looked less at news frames and delved more deeply into the actors and their roles in the news. We discovered in 2018 that there was constant mention of South Korea in the news about North Korea, and that there was paucity in the coverage of the Philippines' China pivot then. Thus, in this paper, I examined more thoroughly how the countries are reported to be independent from or interconnected to each other, as well as how they are interrelated to other stakeholders. This research was informed by concepts in policy research, communication studies, and journalism. From policy research, I got the binary ideas of state and non-state actors. State actors are individuals or organizations that directly assume the roles and responsibilities of governance. In comparison, non-state actors are people or groups that are independent of government but which may hold influence over it. From communication studies, I got the notion of the corporate body, which can be conceptualized in two ways. The unit as its own actor with its distinct personality and behavior, or the unit as exemplified by actors with their own personalities and behaviors, which then characterize the unit itself. Finally, from journalism studies, I gathered understanding of the roles of media, not just as reporters, but as meta sources of news. I also wanted to check how news agencies and journalists performed as policy actors and corporate bodies. I explored these three concepts as they related to, firstly, North Korea and South Korea, secondly, across three Philippine media outlets, and thirdly, before and during the ongoing pandemic. Guided by this literature and framework, I asked the question, how are the two Koreas reported individually and in connection to each other in Philippine online news reports? In the conduct of this study, I followed Norman Fairclough's critical discourse analysis framework which examines content at the micro level of text, the meso level of discursive practice, and the macro level of social practice. Specifically, I looked at the micro level at words and pictures in online news reports about Korea. At the meso level, I then surfaced two major discourses, each of which has underlying themes. These discourses are plot motifs and actor tropes. Finally, at the macro level, I examined how the news mediates the state in terms of personification and enactment. Let me now explain how I implemented the study. In this discourse analysis, I employed both quantitative content analysis and qualitative textual analysis. Included in the study were online news reports from three media outlets from September 1, 2019 to August 31, 2020. I did not yet look at comments about which I will discuss later. To construct the database, I did an advanced Google search for the keyword Korea within the domain of the three media outlets. I then filtered the advanced search results using the news search portal, and then I sorted the dates. The resulting database had 518 articles. These articles were all coded for the quantitative content analysis. Meanwhile, I purposefully identified exemplar articles for the iterative reading for the qualitative textual analysis. The study covers Korea content that appears in ABS-CBN, Inquirer, and Rappler. ABS-CBN is the most popular online portal of a legacy broadcaster, with its likes and followers bigger than runner-up GMA. Inquirer, meanwhile, is the most popular online portal of a legacy newspaper, with its likes and followers about twice that of runner-up Manila Bulletin. Finally, Rappler is the top purely online news portal, the following of which is significantly bigger than Business World. Across these three portals, 161 articles, or 32%, came from ABS-CBN. 144, or 28%, were from Inquirer, and 210, or 40%, from Rappler. Let me now go to the findings. I start with a micro level of text, as essayed in the words and pictures about Korea in online news. The content analysis revealed majority of the articles to be about South Korea, with only 18% of reports about North Korea. News reports about South Korea and the Philippines comprised 15% of the stories, while those about the two Koreas accounted for 9%. There were no stories about the Philippines and North Korea. Outside of the three countries, Three others figured quite prominently in the news: China, USA, and Japan, each of which had specific connections to either of the Koreas. Before the spike of 68 articles in Feb 2020, there was an average of 32 articles between September 2019 and January 2020. From March to August this year, there was an average of 48 news articles per month. The pandemic was the top story in the year of the study. It accounted for 39% of all stories. Outside of it, foreign affairs, lifestyle and culture, and the military were the top three stories, followed by local affairs, economic affairs, and sports. The coverage of the pandemic provided for rather consistent characterizations of either Korea. North Korea's medical system was described as ill-equipped and weak, and the country itself as impoverished and closed. North Korea's figures about its COVID-19 cases were not accepted as factual, with reports using phrases such as quote and unquote insists it is free and claims to be. On the other hand, South Korea's count of its COVID-19 cases was reported in a straightforward manner, highlighting instead how the situation is very grave and that the country has the most infections, the worst affected, and the largest outside China. As the pandemic progressed, the story was of increasing difficulty in North Korea and redemption in South Korea. Who gets to enact the stories? The choice of actors changes the focus and flavor of the story as it indicates who is the pivotal character or who holds the expert opinion in the topic. Collectively, it impresses upon the audience the important people in specific discourses. Let us look at the following titles on COVID-19 as examples of how people or groups are privileged by being the titular actor in stories. The titles also indicate whether the action is collective or singular in nature. The first title focuses on the head of state, the second on the state itself, while the third situates the pandemic among the public as cases. The fourth and fifth ones consider institutions. The fifth and sixth ones, meanwhile, show either the organization or its officer as actor. Based on their titles, for over a third of the stories, it was the state itself which served as the actor, followed by members of the public and heads of state. The coronavirus and the military as objects ranked fourth. How about in terms of the content itself? Absent the country as an actor, who gets to speak on its behalf? I coded at most two such speakers for each article, for a total of 878 characters. Interestingly, government officials and their agencies comprised a third of the report actors. Heads of state, members of the public, and the media completed the top five. Note, however, that country-specific findings were quite different. Government officials, agencies, and the public were the top three for South Korea, whereas head of state and state media were the top ones for North Korea. In terms of their origin, a big majority of the actors came from South Korea. Only 13% came from North Korea and 11% from the Philippines. How about pictures? 91% of the stories were accompanied by a picture. Of these 470 pictures, 19% featured members of the public and 18% showed various settings. And these were pictures mostly from South Korea. Heads of state appeared in 15% of the pictures, and this category was dominated by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Pictures of frontliners, personalities, and celebrities from South Korea comprise about 10% of the study population, respectively. Military images, usually about South Korea and North Korea, or South Korea and the Philippines, accounted for 6%. Now, from this base analysis of text, let me proceed to discursive practices. I found two major discourses in terms of plot motifs and actor tropes. Let me first discuss plot motifs, under which I surfaced country-specific and cross-country themes. What were the key discourses in North Korea in the year under study? There was much speculation about Kim Jong-un's health, whether he was sick or has died, to which the US and South Korea reacted. North Korea's relations with the US, especially as regards President Donald Trump's relationship with Kim Jong-un, was also a staple topic. North Korea's missile testing was also figured in the news. As I said earlier, North Korea's pandemic response, from the ferocity of it to the insinuations about the lack of it, also made it to the news. The news frequently cited the Korea Central News Agency, making media in this regard both source and reporter. The stories about North Korea thus painted a picture of centralized control, yet constant uncertainty. For South Korea, the pandemic was the top story. Firstly, from the initial gravity that was described as the worst outside China, to the successes of its test, trace, and treat approach. Secondly, from its waves of pandemic to the pockets of transmission. And thirdly, the return of sports as a symbol of people's return to public spaces. Outside the pandemic, other discourses pertain to the apparently love-hate relationship between South Korea and Japan, and the performance of South Korea's economy in general and its big corporations in particular. Celebrities were framed in terms of the positive and negative consequences of fame, from the successes of BTS, Crash Landing on You, and Parasite, to the numerous personalities who died by suicide. Many of the stories that emanated from South Korea featured government agencies and their officials. Collectively, the themes from South Korea demonstrated diversity in its characters or in their characters, stories, and frames, as well as diversions from the pandemic trajectory and in popular entertainment. For the Philippines, pop culture stories, especially with the popularity of BTS, Crash Landing on You, and the arrival and non-arrival of the Running Man, dominated the Korean discourse and overshadowed the rather limited coverage of the president's visit to Korea. Stories about Filipino women, especially one who was recognized for being the epitome of filial duty, also got covered across platforms, as did the story about a former South Korean embassy official in the Philippines. The paucity in stories involving the Philippines in Korean affairs, where countries such as US, China, and Japan take precedence, made it appear as a fifth wheel in geopolitical alignments in the region. Instead, Philippine news, as it pertained to Korea, was rather soft in nature. Stories about sports and entertainment outnumbering those about politics and the economy. Across the two Koreas, the intersections were mainly about the confluence and conflation of politics, military, and foreign affairs. When North Korea fired its missiles, the South reacted. When a group from South Korea distributed flyers, the North responded and the South disavowed. Even Crash Landing on You, with its North Korea-South Korea theme and military subplot, received attention from the North, which said, and I quote, "Recently, South Korean authorities and film producers are releasing anti-republic films and TV dramas that are deceptive, fabricated, absurd, and impure, putting all their efforts on making strategic propaganda. End quote. Comparing the discourses about either Korea, what emerged was a dichotomy between the homogeneous North that featured the central leadership and which was reported by state media. In comparison, the stories about the South demonstrated the country's heterogeneous stakeholders and their stories. Whereas the North was shown to be very centralized, news reports constantly hinted at uncertainty and posed questions about control. Meanwhile, the South was depicted to be rather decentralized with its numerous actors, yet they were shown to act with certainty and control. News about the pandemic reinforced these themes. For instance, reports hinted at the North's supposed inability to provide adequate response, as the image here shows. In contrast, figures released by South Korea about the rising number of cases there were taken at face value and always juxtaposed against images of frontliners in action, as the image here shows. Now let me go to actor tropes. For reports about North Korea, it was the head of state which were the main actors. For South Korea and the Philippines, it is the government agencies and their officials, as well as members of the public, which spoke for them in the news. In terms of pictures, the head of state appeared in majority of the images about North Korea. For the South, it was the public, different locations in the country, and its frontliners in action that they were depicted most frequently. For the intersections between North Korea and South Korea, heads of state and the military were shown. Whereas for the Philippines and South Korea, what were shown were personalities and celebrities, as well as the military. In particular, the Philippines' new Navy frigates from South Korea. Let me show you how the actors were illustrated in the reports. These images are copyrighted from the respective wire agencies and outlets. For North Korea, the image was almost always its supreme leader. Kim Jong-un, as he sat next to the flag, stood with world leaders such as US President Trump, or positioned for a hero angle perspective. State media released the images, and the wire agencies and local media outlets used them as trope. This Agence France Presse article describes the situation, and I quote, "The North carefully controls and calibrates imagery of Kim, and analysts said his uncovered features send an intended message," as shown in the picture here where he is not wearing a mask. For South Korea, citizens were always in positive action. From members of the public who were almost always wearing masks properly, to the frontliners who were engaged in preventing the spread of COVID-19. As the pandemic was getting resolved there, life in the public sphere became the focus of images as illustrated here. And according to, as exemplified by the quote here from Kim Tae-hyung, "I am a member of a community football club, and we went out to play on Saturday for the first time in 2 months." And you'll see how the mask is the idea of religious mask wearing is emphasized in this article. He continues, "We were wearing a mask while we played, still worried about the coronavirus, but the weather was nice and I felt so refreshed." So the South Korea in this sense is very humanized. What may be behind the micro-level words and images, as well as the meso-level plot motifs and actor tropes? To answer this, I looked at the media as another actor that does the personification of the other actors in the news. And in so doing, arguably performs the enactment of news. Let me return to my literature-based study framework to structure my arguments. Based on the foregoing discussion, I found that the reports depicted a narrative of the national character that was at once reflexively related to the character of its nationals, who served as its actors. The packaging of the state as a corporate body on its own and through its actors was thus made neat or clean for the audience. What then happens to the balance between state and non-state actors, which points to the level of centralization of government, or at least as reported in the news? I found that stories collectively used the state as the titular actor, effectively embodying the state and the government as one entity. Moreover, among all characters in the stories themselves, there were as many state as non-state actors. When it came to pictures, however, it was the public that was depicted. Let me note, however, that this was the full corpus about South Korea, North Korea, and the Philippines. There were country-specific and cross-country nuances in the coverage, as I have explained earlier. It remained, however, that in this collective discourse, much of the acting is done by South Korean actors. I also found that non-human corporate entities acted in the titles, but human actors gave life to the stories and images. Which now brings me to an important argument about the enactment of news, where the media are not just reporters or sources, but really gatekeepers and agenda setters. They are, by virtue of their role, media actors themselves. And who are they? The dominance of wire agencies in international news flows was readily apparent in this study. Collectively, they reported 78% of all stories, with AFP accounting for 42%. Only 15% of stories were produced in-house by ABS-CBN, Inquirer, and Rappler. Over two-thirds of the news stories came from South Korea, and it perhaps bears investigating to what extent does the location of a news bureau, relate to the topics, frames, and actors integrated in a story. Finally, while I counted 61 writers, of whom 36 were Filipinos, the majority of the stories were written by only two people, one AFP correspondent, and to a smaller degree, one Reuters reporter. Moreover, there was quite a clear matching between local outlets and international agencies. ABS-CBN used AFP and Reuters, Rappler used AFP, and the Inquirer used Associated Press, as well as Korea Herald/Asia News Network. Across outlets, stories mostly emanated from South Korea, with Inquirer depending most heavily on its connections there. Essentially, therefore, we had what appeared to be a small community of media actors that essayed the story of the two Koreas for our local consumption. Let me now go to the conclusion and implications. In summary, we find that Korea is articulated in the news through plot motifs and actor tropes, which then present the character of the nation-state to the reader. International news flows linking the two Koreas and the Philippines demonstrate the continuing power of wire agencies and reporters, with local readers getting wire-specific rather than source-diverse content. Seoul as dateline also serves to mediate the news about the North. Finally, we find limited local mediation of international news as we observe shoveling of news from wire agencies. To some extent, there is some intervention with pictorial choice. But what I find is that there is focus instead on producing local content on lifestyle topics such as entertainment and sports. In conclusion, the study surfaces how the two Koreas are depicted to be independent of yet interconnected to each other. They have stakeholders separately and collectively. Unfortunately, however, in either case, the Philippines is not that visible. There remains the need to disrupt hegemonic international news flows. Though the emergence of Korea Herald/Asia News Network is a welcome development, local newsrooms can be enjoined to produce content beyond the cultural and to help contextualize foreign news for Philippine audiences. Moving forward, we may look at the other actors who, through their behavior, help enact the news. There are many other actors out there. Among these are Google and other search engines, the algorithms of which filter which stories appear in results that then comprise the databases that we construct for message analysis, such as this one. Social media platforms that the personalization techniques of which determine which news we see based on our online platform are another type of media actor. Personally, however, my next project would be to look at how readers engage with these stories online by way of their comments and reactions. Because of the cybernetic relationship between the audience and the sources, readers are now actors as well. That ends my presentation, and in closing, I would like to thank my friends and colleagues at the UP Korea Research Center for supporting this project. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments. Salamat!
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Paragas. And now for our second speaker, we have Professor Correa. Michelle Camille Correa is a lecturer at the Communication Department of the Ateneo de Manila University. She teaches classes on the Korean wave and Korean film. She has a master's degree in Korean studies, a joint international program between Chulalongkorn University in Thailand and Seoul National University in Korea through the ASEAN University Network Scholarship. She was also the recipient of the Korean Language Training Fellowship by the Korea Foundation, where she studied Korean language at Yonsei's KLI, or Korean Language Institute. She also holds a master's degree in communication from Ateneo de Manila University. So dear audience, please welcome Professor Michelle Correa.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we could see it.
Okay. Um, okay. Yeah. So good afternoon. I am Michelle Correa from the Communication Department of the Ateneo de Manila University. So first of all, I would like to thank the UP Korea Research Center for this opportunity to put my thoughts about Korean drama Crash Landing on You from a blog written sometime in April of this year to an actual paper. It has certainly allowed me to reflect on and develop my initial impressions of Crash Landing with regards to representation after watching it early this year. So what follows are my initial findings on the representations of inter-Korean relations in the Korean drama Crash Landing on You, or Chloe, the meanings that are created through these representations, and what it says about notions of power relations between the North, which is being represented, and the South, which is doing the representing. So as this is a work in progress, I'm looking forward to the feedback and questions and comments from the audience. And I will be very grateful for constructive feedback that will help me flesh out this project some more. So Crash Landing on You, as all of you know, is a South Korean TV drama about a successful businesswoman from the South named Yoon Se-ri, who, while paragliding and testing her fashion business's new sporty clothing line, encounters a strange tornado which blows her straight to the northern side of the demilitarized zone, or the DMZ. So there she meets Lee Jong-yok, a military officer from the north. So, kind-hearted man that he is, he helps Zeri to safely make her way back to the south. In the process, they get to know each other and then they fall in love. So Chloe is said to be inspired by a real-life incident that happened to actress Zhong Yang in Incheon sometime in 2008. So during this time, bad weather caused the boat that the actress was riding to almost cross the northern limit line, which is separating the two Koreas. So in terms of ratings, it did very well, as it is to date the second highest rated cable TV drama in South Korean history. So Sky Castle occupies first place. So Korea, the North and the South. So in another place and time, Yoon Se-ri would just have gotten up after her accident, dusted herself off, and crossed the border. End of story. But no. What makes this drama interesting is that the actual site of the emergency landing is a strip of land called the DMZ that divides Korea into the north and south. So in a nutshell, the DMZ exists as a buffer zone between the two Koreas, which are still technically at war. So the two sides are on ceasefire or armistice. So of course, when you're technically at war, the other side is off limits. And that's why the initial encounter between the two drama's characters was marked by suspicion and to a certain degree fear. But as the drama progressed, as you know, most of the characters from both sides became friends, except for the drama's number one villain, Zo Chol-kang, a lieutenant commander in the North Korean Armed Forces Security Bureau, who remained salty about the South throughout the drama and about life in general throughout Crash Landing's run. So the making of Crash Landing. So if you read the newspapers, news articles about Crash Landing is widely praised for having a very meticulous, nuanced, and well-researched portrayal of North Korea. So the North Korean setting in terms of daily life in a small village, as well as life in the northern capital of Pyongyang, from the objects used to the hair and makeup and even the makeup style. Even speech patterns of the people were recreated to the best of the creator's ability. So this very high attention to detail was made possible because of painstaking research involving books, consultation with experts, such as North Korean language expert who reviewed the drama script, and interviewing North Korean defectors, which included soldiers, doctors, wives of military officers, and merchants, among others. And also, the writing team included a North Korean defector named Kwak Moon-won. So he was a former member of North Korea's Supreme Guard Command, which protects the Kim family, and was also a film student at Pyongyang University of Dramatic and Cinematic Arts. So he seems quite legit, right? So a lot has been said academically about Crash Landing on You by scholars Epstein and Green. So They had a recent article about the changes in the way the South represents the North in pop culture products such as TV series, and its impact on pop culture product in terms of international relations and diplomacy. So according to them, Chloe is, and I quote, likely the most noteworthy South Korean popular culture representation of North Korea yet produced, unquote. And I would like to contribute to this study by first examining the meanings that are created through these representations, and what it says about notions of power relations between the North, which is being represented in the South, which is doing the representing. So using Stuart Hall's notion of representation, this paper looks into meaning making accorded by the South in depicting itself in the North. So rather than accurately trying to measure the distortion and accuracy of a representation, I would like to take a look at the choices that were made by the drama series' actors in representing the North and the South. So the ideological frame that emerges as a result, the presence and absence in the representations made, and ultimately who holds power and resources to produce this series and its subsequent implications. So representations are basically choices that were made by whoever created a media product. So at this point, I would like to provide a brief explanation of what representation is um, from a communication point of view. So I feel that being on the same page in terms of what the term representation means is an important starting point. So when we hear the word representation, what often comes to mind is portrayal and depiction, and consequently how accurate and real something is. So, but however, we might want to ask ourselves, whose reality is it? If you'll read some news articles about Chloe, even defectors cannot agree within themselves what is real and accurate in North Korean portrayals in Chloe. So, for example, in a Korea Herald article titled Creators of Crash Landing on You explains the making of the film. The North Korean defectors who were interviewed had different views on the usage of a makeshift water heater by putting together a plastic shower stall. So I hope you remember that scene about the plastic shower stall. On the one hand, the portrayal drew flack from a defector who said that the portrayal was, I quote, too condescending, unquote. So one of the defectors who were consulted for this drama said that this makeshift plastic shower stall was used in the 1960s. But on the other hand, you have uh, YouTuber Kang Nara, another North Korean defector, who said that this makeshift plastic shower stall is being used up to now, but in the rural north. So they don't agree about that. What is real and what is not about that plastic shower stall. And then there's the North Korean government who called recent portrayals of North Korea in South Korean media immoral, insulting, and an atrocious provocation for portraying the North in what they perceive to be a negative portrayal. So although the North didn't specifically name Chloe as one of the culprits it is widely believed to be Chloe, among other um, media products. So whereas South Korean and international viewers would welcome this humanizing glimpse into North Korean daily life, for the North being depicted as an underdeveloped country plagued by blackouts is quote-unquote propaganda. So a lot of newspaper articles highlight the painstaking effort that the production team made in ensuring an accurate portrayal of the North. This while at the same time doing a balancing act between accuracy and avoiding glorifying and misrepresenting North Korea. So in this very act of doing a balancing act between making an effort to make portrayals accurate and at the same time avoiding misrepresentation shows that choices have definitely been made by the creators in portraying the North. So representation produces meaning. So when creators create a certain media form, in this case, a TV drama, choices were made in the following. So first, what to show about North Korea. Second, what to show about North Korea in relation to the South. And third, what is said about North Korea. And according to scholar Stuart Hall, making these choices produces meaning. So these choices make constructed images that are imbued with ideology. So there's no one meaning, and these meanings are also ever changing. So in this sense, rather than looking at a right or a wrong representation, and whether it is accurate or not, Stuart Hall highlighted power. So that is the role of representation in making certain meanings more dominant over many other meanings. So rather than realism, we look at verisimilitude, which is not what is right or wrong, which is not what is a right or a wrong portrayal, but to what the dominant culture believes to be credible, suitable, and a proper representation. But so why do we have to care about representation or how um, the North and the South are portrayed in media? So at this point, you might be wondering, why do we have to care about this? Entertainment is entertainment, right? So why not just sit back, relax, and enjoy a drama like Crash Landing on You? Well, what we see through the various media that we consume, first, molds particular ways of seeing, and second, it constructs a certain reality, and which results in political and ethical consequences. So that is what we learn about and know about things through the media affects the way we respond to whatever happens in the world. So, for example, think about the concept of papa and the Korean man that we see in Korean TV dramas. So somehow, by watching Korean TV dramas, we're molded to see Korean men as being insanely handsome, tall, lean, having chocolate abs, and at the same time being sensitive, thoughtful, and considerate. So in other words, perfect. That is how the K-drama world constructs a reality about Korean men. But maybe as you get immersed in the K culture more, you decide to visit South Korea one day, and what other reality do you see? What kind of Korean men do you see? And are they the same men that you have come to know through K dramas? But on a more serious note, North Korea tends to be a very closed country. We know so little about it, and what little we know about it depends on what we see on film and TV, and what we read in news and other literature, and also speeches. Mm, yeah, and various representations of the North have been made in Western media. So, according to scholars Neighbors and Shin, I hope I'm pronouncing their names right. So, they said, and I quote, North Korea is simultaneously seen in a rather contradictory terms when it comes to international affairs. It is strong yet weak, rational yet irrational, and deserving of either international condemnation, isolation and sanctions, or commiseration, cooperation, and assistance. So, moreover, representational patterns and key visual themes of the North's representation in Western media include backwardness, bleakness, madness, dangerousness, isolation, poverty, scarcity, and weakness, which is, according to them, the opposite of globalization. And of course, North Korea has also been represented in South Korean media. So in South Korean media, meanwhile, according to Cho, who studied representations of North Korean migrants on South Korean television, she says that North Korean defectors are represented as national conservatives, that is, people who are liberal, capitalist, anti-communist, and who have cultural nationalism. And also, according to her, images of North Koreans in South Korea are stereotypical and gendered. So men are portrayed as rustic North Korean men. And also, North Korea is represented as a docile wife in a patriarchal marriage. And ultimately, representations show superiority of South Korean citizens over North Korean migrants. So, in analyzing representations of inter-Korean relations in this study, I consider the text, um, or what is overtly being said or about Chloe, and covert what Chloe implies about inter-Korean relations. And I also um, look at visual codes, the production design, location set design, and those kinds of things, power and resources, and intertextuality. So in analyzing these media representations, I try to determine the intertextual links being employed to previous texts and how these links are being used to represent the world in a certain manner. So what follows is my interpretation of what meanings are produced in Khloe, meanings about North Korea and South Korea. Um, so first, a decadent South and a covert triangle of capitalism and globalization in the North. So under this overarching representation, I also identified a portrayal about the North's rural villages and local market as a site for trade and secret southern quote-unquote worship. And also, under this overarching theme is Pyongyang, a site for the inner workings of capitalism or a site of internationality. So a common pattern and theme in Chloe is of a developed cosmopolitan and decadent or self-centered South and a backward traditional North with a heart of gold. So I feel that this is also Chloe's overarching representation. So the opening credits show the parallel lives of the main leads and second leads. So for the main characters, Seri and Songyuk, we see a glimpse of what they eat. So Korean food versus Western food, what they drink, something in a white cup and a wine, what they wear, a soldier's uniform and briefcase versus a business suit, um, which Jim Seri was wearing, where they go. So they cross paths, but they do not interact in a city that seems to be so. For the second leads, we see Sodan in Kusanzun. We see that they both have hints of Western influences within them. And as for the supporting characters, we see that the North Korean characters are shown in their neighborhood outside of Pyongyang, with men wearing soldiers' uniforms and women wearing seemingly outdated clothes. And meanwhile, we see southern characters in a park with men wearing suits and women wearing dresses. The first few scenes of episode 1 shows the South's economic prosperity through skyscrapers, electricity and lights, even through the night. We also see Sherry's life of seeming excess and scandal. In contrast, the first few glimpses of the North that we see are connected to the military. We see soldiers at the northern limit line engaged in military confrontation. With the South, due to suspected looters who are allegedly stealing South Korean historical artifacts at the southern limit line. And we also see a soldier at the guard post, whom we know later as Kim Jumok, who is infatuated with Hallyu, or the Korean wave, particularly a Korean drama by Choi Ji-woo. He was unable to heed the call of his comrades because he was busy watching a drama. So interestingly, he is portrayed as someone obsessed with watching K-dramas, in particular, very old Korean dramas. So moreover, our first glimpse of a North Korean village is that there are no lights, there is no smartphone. It is something like a farming community. And episode 2 is where we first get a glimpse of North Korean way of life, specifically life outside of North's capital, Pyongyang. It is undeveloped, has no internet, and has landline phones instead of cell phones. And we are taken to Captain E's house, the interior of which calls to mind old styles of the 1970s or 1980s in South Korea. So we see a slow, provincial kind of life. So these kinds of comparisons between a developed South and an underdeveloped North continues throughout the succeeding episodes of Chloe. And I would like to talk more about North Korea's rural villages in the local market and how it is represented as a site for trade and secret Southern admiration. So, episode 2 in Chloe is where we first see a local market in rural North Korea, where South Korean goods can be bought in secret, such as cosmetics, underwear, bras, and clothes. Interestingly, in this local market, South Korean goods like cosmetics are preferred over European ones. Uh, Inside houses in this small village are quote unquote illegal goods, such as a South Korean talking rice cooker. And also birthdays, such as the high-ranking military wife's birthday, showed us that gifts from the South are much appreciated. So they like things from the South. Fashion trends from the South too are praised. So even men are not spared from the South's charms, as we also see Master Sergeant Kyo Chi-soo trying Southern shampoo, conditioner, and body wash, and liking it. So in the end, he cannot live without shampoo, conditioner, and body wash. And here I elaborate more on Pyongyang as a site for the inner workings of capitalism or a site of internationality. So Chloe paints a picture of Pyongyang as a city with hotels, skyscrapers, transportation like cars and trains. In other words, a semblance of the city life that we know. So Pyongyang, we learn, is a place of sophistication and cosmopolitanism, but in North Korean standards. So coffee, which the North's neighbors in the South like very much, as evidenced by the many cafes in South Korea, is also a thing with Pyongyang residents, as Koi shows. From sweet instant coffee sent as relief goods from the South to the North, uh, which we learn later are just used by high military officials, to coffee served in a Pyongyang hotel. So in the drama, caramel macchiato is considered sophisticated, but is actually a regular drink anywhere else, like in the South. So we see that coffee consumption in Pyongyang is linked to a certain degree of social status. Pyongyang is also the place where we see big businesses in the form of a department store owned by Sodan's mother. So interestingly, she loves throwing around Dan's mother loves throwing around English words that she learned. So for example, in episode 4, Dan was surprised to find out that her mother learned English, as English is tied to their enemy, the Americans. So her mother replied, so when Dan asked, why did you learn English? So her mother replied that she learned the language of the quote unquote enemy. So Dan's uncle added that Dan's mother learned English after being humiliated in a meeting for not knowing the language. And her mother also said that English is important to know for doing international business. So this drama also teaches us that in the North, political families have ties to the military. Wealth is also tied to the military. Such is the case with Cho Dang, lieutenant commander in the North Korean Armed Forces Security Bureau, who has quote-unquote a side job, criminal operation involving providing a secret hiding place inside state property nonetheless. He provides a secret hiding place to international fugitives, one of whom is Koo Seung-jun from South Korea. And also, an interesting manifestation of capitalism's inner workings in North Korean people occurs in episode 14, with Cho Chol-gang in Seoul saying, while he is brought to a makeshift clinic to treat his injury. So he says, capitalism saved my life. So why is this? Why did he say that capitalism saved my life? This is the episode where this broker admitted that the only reason why he was being saved and his wounds being treated was because he hasn't received his payment yet. So he's just trying to keep Chochodang alive in order to receive his payment. So business is business. So even the doctor who removed the bullet from Chochodang's body, just viewed it as a job in exchange for money. With the character of Chochodang, and for me, he is actually one of the more interesting characters in this drama. We see that people from the lower rungs of North Korean society, okay, we see that people from the lower rungs of North Korean society subverting socioeconomic class, both through military hard power and monetary power. So at one point in the drama, Jo Chol-gang declares that he hates people who are born with a silver spoon. And the second representation that I would like to discuss is the Hallyu effect. So throughout Chloe, we see various signs of North Koreans being enamored by the South. So in other words, we see the South's soft power, meaning it has managed to get the hearts and minds of Northerners even without a single bullet. So for example, Kim Joo-mok, one of Captain Lee's soldiers, is a big fan of K-dramas. South Koreans' goods are also the goods of choice in local markets, even if bought secretly. So, and a lot of North Korean youth in this drama are also fans of BTS and K-pop. And also, Northerners can speak in the South Korean way, specifically the Seoul dialect, because of their consumption of K-drama and K-pop. They even know Korean slang. Uh, and also, even the elite um, has a certain degree of preference for Southern goods. So even Sodang's wedding dress is inspired by a photo from a fashion magazine from the South, from South Korea, which was smuggled by Northerners via Shanghai and China. So this was in the drama. And last but not least, in Seoul, when Jonghyuk soldiers went to rescue him, uh, Kumundong, the youngest member of his unit, became addicted to South Korean computer games. So in this drama shows that no one from the North was spared from the Hallyu effect from South Korea. Well, except for Joseon, of course. The next representation is of northern country. Is of northern characters as country bumpkins in the South. So a key episode is episode 10. So episode 10 is where we see the tables being turned. So if in episodes 1 to 9, it was Seri who adjusted to North Korean life, now it is the Northerners who must adjust to life in the South. So Jong-hyuk traveled to South Korea to protect Seri against Cho Chol-gang. So Jong-hyuk's comrades, in return, traveled to South Korea to protect him and to bring him back to the North safely at the behest of his father. His comrades traveled to South Korea under the guise of belonging to North Korean track team of Military World Games. So here in this episode, we see them outside of their military clothes for the first time. And their first impressions of South Korea mm, make them look like country bumpkins. So in the bus, they see a South Korea that is filled with cars. And Sisu, one of the soldiers, assumes that they just filled the cars with rows, with just fill the roads with cars just for show. And while they were eating at a convenience store, they were also amazed at the abundance of food like rice and noodles. And other things that amazed them about South Korea were the non-stop electricity, the automatic door in Sari's house, the free flowing water from the faucet, and the warm floor, even without a furnace. So now I would like to talk about the presence and absence. So what is there and not there in the representation, in the choices made by the creators of Chloe in representing the North and the South. So the first is the absence or exclusion of governments of the North and South at the highest levels. So we don't see a president, we don't see a quote unquote year leader. So for example, in episode 14, North Korean soldiers came to South Korea not for politics, but for a private individual, namely Yoon Seri, to rescue her. So, and Social Gang came for personal revenge against Jong-yok by way of hurting Seri. Perhaps this absence or exclusion is because mentioning topmost leaders in this is forbidden. So it is a very sensitive issue. So the absence, especially for the North, so the absence of this representation is probably a choice that the creators consciously made, it being very sensitive. So the second presence, another presence is a business-led South and a militaristic North. So in this drama, we saw that the South dealt with the North predominantly through the Chaebol, as with the case with Sari's father in bringing Sari back to South Korea, and also with how Sari's brother and sister-in-law tried to keep her in the North. So while Sari's brother and sister-in-law were trying to keep Sari in the North, they dealt with uh, the military. Okay. Another exclusion was the exclusion of actual defection. So, um, Song-Nok and his soldiers went to the south, and although Captain E's soldiers seemed to enjoy their time in the south, they chose to go back to the north. The reason was not explicitly mentioned. However, in one of the last few episodes, the way the youngest soldier missed his hometown provides a clue, however insufficient. And also, well, in an episode where Captain E himself, while he was drinking soju with Seri, he admits that he doesn't want to go back to North Korea. Um, it was quite a sad scene. He said he wants to marry Seri in South Korea and have twins. And he was on, on the verge of tears in that scene. So the question in my mind is, so what does this represent? Is this a representation that that North Korea is getting enamored with the South? I don't have an answer to that yet, and as defection is again a very sensitive and controversial issue, again this exclusion seems to be a very conscious choice that the creators made. And last but not least is the presence of neutral ground, Switzerland. So the end of the opening credits show that the two lead characters face to face in a nature-filled place, which we later on learn is Switzerland. So they are seemingly of equal status here if one will look at their appearance in terms of clothes. And in episode 9, we learned that Switzerland was a place where they first encountered each other through music and art. So although usually Seri as a South Korean would be preoccupied with business, and Jonghyuk as a North Korean would be preoccupied with military matters, at their core, they turn to art as humans, especially in Switzerland. So art connects them to humanity, and also in Switzerland, Jonghyuk's music saved Seri from death. So why Switzerland? Again, I don't have the full answer to this yet, except that Switzerland seems to be a neutral ground where they can be their most human and authentic selves, since it's very neutral ground. Um, yeah, so there. Another interesting representation in Khloe is of a female South and a male North. This is quite different from other representations of North and South in previous films and TV dramas, wherein the male characters tended to be uh, from the South and the female characters tended to be from the North. So now it's switched up. So female South. So we see that Siri has no military power, but however, she has brains. She's very smart, and she also has a business that rakes in financial power. So she comes from a tribal family, which is probably a conscious choice to show the economic might of the South. In South Korea, we see Sari's power and strength to protect Jonghyuk through her brains. So in one episode, she went to a dangerous looking neighborhood where the Korean Chinese live. And turns out she bought the buildings where these people live, where these gang members live, and she made a deal with them. Whoever can find Jo Chol Kang first will be rewarded with money, of course. And interestingly, she only bought two of her staff who obviously cannot fight physically. She had no bodyguard, but she was confident with her brains and her financial might. And then we have a male North in Lee Jong-hyuk. So Jong-hyuk is a military man with a heart of gold. He has pure and traditional values that tames the decadent tendencies of Seri, so our woman from the South. Captain E, the son of the Director General of the Political Bureau, is portrayed as a strong man, physically and mentally, and is also sensitive, which kind of follows conventions for K-drama male leads. Interestingly, his background is presented to be kind of at par with the female lead, although not really, because he is from the North. And last but not least, intertextuality. Um, so here, I would like to say that although the most obvious manifestation of intertextuality is the appearance of the village idiot in Troy, in the well, he was seen in the Korean film Secretly Greatly, so that was quite obvious. But for me, what carries more weight, personally, is the intertextuality between Chloe and the Korean film Joint Security Area. So, from the shot of the owl in episode 1 to the idea of Switzerland as neutral ground, it really, for me, it calls to mind Joint Security Area. And also, Chloe is widely praised for its humanizing portrayals of the North. And I feel that this humanizing aspect actually takes off from JSA, from Joint Security Area, where we saw two soldiers from the South and two soldiers from the North become friends, and they protected each other till the end. So that was the intertextuality that I saw in terms of the much praised humanizing portrayal of the North in Chloe. So I think it actually sprung from JSA first. And finally, what does this all mean? Um, so what do all of these representations mean? So I feel that by emphasizing the economic prosperity of the South, uh, the attractiveness of South Korean culture among North Korean youth, and by giving us a glimpse of the inner workings of trade in the North, I feel that this all points to the South's power, soft power. Not necessarily military power, but a soft power that is slowly conquering the North's youth, as well as the bottom rungs of Northern society. Moreover, underneath the hard North Korea stance we often see in news, we see employ um, cracks within the system in terms of trade and economy in the North. But beyond entertainment, we are somehow educated that the soft power of the South is in the process of low key conquering the North. So that's it. Thank you. And I would welcome feedback from the audience. Um, it would greatly help me later on. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Correa, and to Dr. Paragas as well. But before I introduce our discussants, I'm reminding everyone to please leave your questions in YouTube chat box. So we will now listen to insights and reflections of our invited distinguished discussants on the said two lectures. We will have Miss Nicollette Dizon, Head of Communications, PayMongo Digital Payments Platform. Please welcome Ms. Dizon.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Ah, I can hear you, ma'am.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dizon, and I was introduced as the head of communications of PayMongo. It's a digital payment platform, but okay, hang on there. Okay, but it is up until last month that I was a practicing journalist. Like I covered the news for the last 20 years, day in, day out, before I moved to the fintech industry because of the pandemic. Um, so as a journalist, I was with Philippine Star and spent a chunk of my career with the Inquirer covering politics, security, and a lot of other issues. And then shortly before I left the industry, I was a desk editor for Rappler. And well, in 2018, I went freelance. I left Inquirer, did freelance, became a freelance journalist where I also discovered lifestyle and entertainment reporting, mainly focusing really on Hallyu, on the Korean wave. So thank you very much for your invitation to here. And thank you for the presentations also, Dr. Paragas and Professor Correa. So I'm here to react to the presentation of Dr. Paragas. And I did like, sir, your title, Man from the North, People from the South, as it's a vivid representation of how we view the two Koreas, one of isolation and the other a community, a vibrant community at that. Um, So for this task that I was given, I reflected on my own work as a journalist, covering security issues as part of my task day. I'm hoping this would give you an idea that it certainly is not easy to cover the news. You know, it's easy to analyze, it's easy to use the frameworks and all, but I also studied it when I was in mass comm like decades ago as a student. But really to be on the ground, to pursue the news, to follow the stories is a lot really different and difficult. So I hope this will give us also perspective, that it's not easy to cover, as I said, compared to how easily people actually label our work as fake news. I did have the opportunity to cover security issues surrounding the Korean Peninsula. I remember in 2012, journalists, including myself, rushed to the Department of National Defense in Camp Aguinaldo after debris from a North Korean rocket launch landed off the coast of northern Luzon. Manila condemned the act, saying the DPRK violated the UN resolutions that demanded North Korea to suspend its ballistic missile program. My fascination with the region grew after my editor at the Inquirer, the late Letty Jimenez Magsanok, assigned me to cover the 60th anniversary of the armistice in Seoul in 2013. These kinds of overseas assignments are very important to journalists like me, as they give us a wider perspective of the region and the world. Certainly, the Korean Peninsula is in the radar of the local newsrooms, especially when the saber rattling gets quite loud and when, as Dr. Paragas noted, test missiles are conducted. And I agree with Dr. Paragas' analysis that news, really, Philippine news, as covered, is almost, oh, sorry, his analysis that news from the DPRK as covered by Philippine media is almost always equated with Kim Jong un. The attempt by the two Koreas in the United States to restart denuclearization efforts in 2019 also received ample space on print, online, and news broadcasts. And this highlights the importance newsrooms give to regional security issues. But the truth is, the Philippines continue to be more concerned and interested with what's happening in the West, especially the United States, compared to what's happening to our own next door neighbors. The coverage of the US presidential elections compared to the coverage of the National Assembly elections in South Korea last April, or the recent elections in Japan, or elections or politics in other ASEAN countries might make another good study, Dr. Paragas, how Philippine media covered all these elections. Um, so whenever I'm assigned to cover regional events, um, I develop a desire to do more stories about our neighbors. A lot of journalists feel that. I go to coverages with other journalists, and we talk about, expanding or widening our horizons. When I was in Inquirer, I dreamed of seeing one day an ASEAN page in the paper. Why? Because 11 years ago, I was on an ASEAN coverage with fellow Southeast Asian journalists. And I found out that all of their papers had pages, like 2 to 4 pages, like two spreads in their newspapers dedicated to news from Southeast Asia. In contrast, Philippine media had world news, the all encompassing world news. After that ASEAN trip, I told an editor that I wanted to specialize in ASEAN news. However, while I followed the news about our neighbors, I wasn't really able to write about the region. Write in earnest about the region. When you're on vacation and you get so inspired, but when you get home, reality hits you? I think that's what happened to me. With the day to day coverage, my ideas ended up in the back burner. You see, newsrooms are structured in such a way that reporters are assigned to beats. Usually, we stay in those beats for 2 to 4 years on average. And we are very conscious not to encroach in each other's beats. beats, meaning like you cover Malacanang, you cover the president, you cover Congress, you cover justice, you cover the church, and we're very conscious not to encroach into each other's beats. So when we talk about stories from Korea or ASEAN or world news, or the US, um, it falls under the purview of the foreign affairs reporter, and then followed by the military reporter or the defense reporter and the Malacanang or the palace reporter. Um, and so that's one reason why I couldn't really go out there and cover ASEAN or Korea as much as I wanted to, because I was assigned to another beat and there's another person who's supposed to cover that for Inquirer. And also, our most pressing regional issue then and now is still our maritime row with China. Personally, I would say that from 2012 to 2016, I was focused on the maritime row. Um, then this administration happened, and we all know what kept journalists busy. Um, but South Korea's new southern policy under the Moon Jae-in administration that promotes, among other things, regional security cooperation should be prominent news here in Manila, as well, of course, as efforts for the reunification. Because why? I think a lot of us have overlooked the fact that the Philippines continues to be part of the United Nations Command, and we have a small contingent of Filipino soldiers based in the UN command post in Seoul. This is where context comes in. And unfortunately, I will admit that even I tend to forget to put context in my stories. It's really a conscious effort for journalists, who submit stories day in day out. We have to meet our respective deadlines, daily deadlines. So on the point made by Dr. Paragas that coverage of the Koreas are often reliant on wire stories, this is because Philippine media outlets cannot really send reporters, overseas. I do remember that there are Filipino journalists who had gone to the DPRK and made documentaries, very interesting documentaries. Um, but as Professor Correa also mentioned, we have to remember that DPRK is a closed country. So, as a media person, any news that comes from DPRK would have to be vetted. And who vets these information? We have no way of independently uh, verifying the information, except we have to ask the South Korean and U.S. intelligence agencies to verify these information, even down to the photos, which is why we use phrases like claims to be, etc., etc. Those qualifiers. As much as reporters like me and editors would love to dispatch Filipino journalists to coverages overseas, uh, that would entail a lot of resources, especially these days. Of course, Filipino journalists can always develop sources in the embassy or in the Korean community here, but for major events taking place in Seoul or anywhere else, we have to no choice but to use wire stories. Mm, we rarely also rewrite these stories as well. As much as we could, we would put in context, especially when the stories impact on the Filipino community or the Philippine economy or our bilateral ties. Um, and we also, which is the reason why we seldom see bylines of Filipino journalists under these stories. These stories, we buy these stories. We actually can do anything what we could actually re-edit the stories, but more often than not, yeah, we just fix the stories to put in the Filipino flavor or the context, in terms, so that our audience will understand the importance of this story vis-a-vis Filipinos overseas. or in that country. And so I reached out to a former Philippine ambassador to Seoul, and asked him what he thought of the Philippine media's coverage of the Korean Peninsula. He said the Philippine media actually, for him, amply covered the dangerous conflict between South Korea and DPRK when he was in Seoul. He recalled the media highlighted the serious concern over the conflict's impact on the 60,000 Filipinos living and working in South Korea, raising awareness on the importance of stability and security in the region. Let me also, I almost forgot to mention that Inquirer is actually a co-founder of the Asian News Network, and the Korea Herald is also part of it. It's the reason why Inquirer carries a lot of, is able to carry a lot of news from Korea through the ANN partnership. All the others, all other networks and media outlets rely on their wire agency subscriptions. And so lately, I I developed this habit of finding stories I could write about even when I'm on vacation. And so the past couple of years after I discovered um, Hallyu, I had been going to Seoul as a fan, and from these trips, though, I've written a number of lifestyle and entertainment stories. Uh, these were my pre-pandemic stories, datelined Seoul. Um, yeah, so I fell deep into the Korean wave rabbit hole. But the nice thing about it is while I have so much fun watching dramas and Bangtan Sonyeondan, at the same time, I also get the chance to study South Korea's cultural soft power approach as a middle power nation. So I'm able to mix my exposure to security issues and politics with my newfound love for lifestyle and entertainment, which is basically just Hallyu. And also, um, I used to contribute to Inquirer Lifestyle up until my boss, Thelma San Juan, retired also. And I'm very grateful to her because she's the one who always puts contexts in stories. Even if it's lifestyle, people would say, oh, that's fluff stories. But actually, they're not. Ma'am Thelma taught me how to always put context in stories, in lifestyle and entertainment stories. And so that's why we have on Bangtan Sonyeondan, we wrote about a Harvard study on them. Ma'am Thelma analyzed their digital power, etc. And I should also thank Ms. Kyungmin Bae for all the introspective articles she writes and contributes to Inquirer and Rappler. Actually, ako yung agent niya. Ako yung tagapasa sa mga editors. Articles like these, written by experts like Mia, provide Filipino readers a deeper understanding of the Korean wave and, by and large, Korea's soft power. To wrap up, I hope this pandemic can prompt a reboot also in the way media covers the Philippines' neighbors, including South Korea and the DPRK, as much as we could. Um, because, I'd be very frank also that really pre-pandemic, the kind of coverage that we do, um, I'd say we focused on the CCTV exclusives, um, because it's again, I'm sure Dr. Paragas and Professor Correa have studies on this, the chicken and the egg. Uh, do we cater to what the audience wants, or we give them what they should know? So, but with this pandemic, it's now a shared experience for the world. Our global village became a lot smaller. We understand each other better, and so this made Filipino citizens, Filipinos, more attuned and aware and interested in what's happening in other countries, especially our next door neighbors. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Dizon. And our next discussant is Professor Amor Aljibe of the Department of Broadcast Communication, University of the Philippines, Diliman. And Professor Aljibe was also the former film executive of ABS-CBN Film Productions Incorporated Star Cinema. Please welcome Professor Aljibe.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me here. Just like Miss Dizon, I think I'm more of a industry practitioner rather than an academic. Well, unlike her, I didn't prepare a paper because I'd like to hear from Professor Mitch what is really the entire discussion before putting in any impressions. So after hearing her discussion and the PowerPoint, I'd like to make or share some of my observations. Well, just like Professor Mitch, I think I also got interested with Chloe, but not as a form of a media studies, but more on the analysis of the drama series in terms of story and visual elements. But since I am here to share my impressions, first I'd like to say that what I've noticed is that representation was defined in terms of difference. So it speaks more of the binary oppositions. And I don't know if Professor Mitch would like to be interested to include the study of semiotics in presenting her paper. Much of the representations cited by Professor Mitch really were explained in terms of the differences, like the CBB, or rather the OBB, the opening billboard. She mentioned about Captain Ree and Seri engage in their daily activities, but I think very obvious they do have different daily activities. And then she mentioned about the locations, particularly the villages and Pyongyang. So they have a stark difference in terms of their economic activities, and also the Hallyu effect. I think she mentioned about North Koreans being mesmerized with the South Korean cultural products. And then she mentioned about the cosmetic products, like North Koreans favoring South Korean products over European ones. And then the issue on gender, wherein she mentioned about the North and the South being depicted as different actors, with Seri having financial power and Captain Ree having military power. So I think that's one point that I'd like to talk about. Okay. Another thing is that she mentioned about the intention or the readings based on the creators of the drama series. I just would like to suggest, if ever she will do an extensive research about this topic, the creators for me will not only speak about the South Korean producers, but I think we have to consider Netflix as the financier. And also Netflix is also part of the creator of the drama series. This is one thing that I think the paper can take another direction. And coming from the local industry, I think we can make use of the visual elements or the visual codes as our guide in explaining how representation is being made. I was somehow expecting that there will be particular scenes that will be lifted and defined in terms of the point of view of the creators. One approach would be to look at the intention of the creators of Chloe on uh, on their decisions on what scenes to include in the final edit. She has made mention about not really knowing the meaning why a particular choice was made. I think if she will only have the chance to interview the creators, there could be another source of finding out the meaning behind, because that would be speaking about another approach which is known as intentional. So the reading is not really coming from the author of the work, but the reading can come exactly from the creators of the show. And we can consider here the framework known as a political economy, wherein the ideology of the creators can also be defined. You know, films, like any other forms of media, also rely on the sales of the product. That's why we also often call them as media products. The media texts that we consume on a daily basis are coming from cultural products. And as products, I think anybody who's the owner of the business behind will be interested also to recoup their costs. That's why one reason in the form of intertextuality or humanizing the characters, particularly North Koreans, I see it also as an approach of the financier or the producers of the show to attract more viewers. I think the intention could be uh, not to show something that would antagonize a particular group, but it is a cultural product that will put everyone at ease, in a way pleasing the audience. But I guess those who can really explain about their meaning, why particular scenes were included, would best be the producers and the creators of the show. And that would include the writer and also the director, because it also has something to do with the vision. It also has something to do with the production design. And she has mentioned about visual codes. So I think in that area, we can expand the discussion of the topic. And then I will be interested because she mentioned about ideological frames. I'd like to know more about what she means by this. And is there any particular framework that she's planning to use in order to see who really holds power and whose reality are we seeking? Um, as you know, representation will always be dependent on meaning and language in order for us to read what is being presented to us. And it will always be made up of the systems of representation. And I'm talking about the signified and the signifiers. What is good about the production of meaning is the fact that meanings will never be final. It is never fixed. That's why even if we have a dominant reading of a particular cultural product, we will always have three choices as readers and as consumers of any media product. One would be the dominant reading, the second would be the negotiated reading, and the third is an oppositional reading. You've seen, I think a clip was flashed while I was speaking. It's one way to illustrate an oppositional reading. This article was already mentioned by Dr. Paragas during his talk, and I think also by Professor Mitch while discussing her topic. So North Korea blasts South's insulting dramas and films. We can only infer that this is about Chloe and another film entitled Ashfall, but we can never be sure about. But what I am trying to pinpoint here is that this is another kind of reading. So the dominant reading will never be forever staying with us on a daily basis, because as the Italian philosopher has mentioned, Gramsci, through his philosophy of praxis, he mentioned that it's a daily battle to win the consent of other groups. And just like us, as consumers of media, I think it's a good news for us that we can forever negotiate. We can forever have an oppositional reading if we are not so comfortable with consuming what is being offered to us. And lastly, I'd like to know also from Professor Mitch if the reading she's making is occupying the subject position, or is it based on another reading? Because only then can we decipher if the reading that is being offered to us, if the construction of meaning based on the representations that were used as examples is also coming from a certain ideology, is it also coming from a particular point of view? So I think that's all I would like to take up this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Aljibe and Ms. Dizon, for your very interesting and insightful comments. Okay, Professors Paragas and Correa, if you wish to, you may say something to the comments and thoughts of our discussants, Sir and Ms. Correa. Sir Paragas, you may start first.
Yes, I would like to thank Nico for such a very fair evaluation of the presentation. Typically sometimes we, can be quite antagonistic because, we're the analysts and the practitioners. But I think in this sense, we agree, that we have the same agenda, that we should at least help reorient the public na, we are part of Asia, we must be better oriented towards the region. And try to pull away our public from too much US. I mean, we get so much US news right now about Trump and Biden, but that's not really that relevant to us right now. There are many much more important happenings in the region. So I think shared for us na, yeah, I'm doing this research too, to help disrupt yung talagang West orientation natin na from our long colonial history. Marami naman pwedeng pag-aralan dito sa atin. Pwedeng maraming report. Kaya I think this orientation towards Asia is important. So I think I agree doon. And yung the daily activities ng journalists, we understand na ganun talaga siya. Kaya nga kumbaga, merong roles din yung media as actor. But I think to anticipate some of the questions na might be posed later, may duty din yung reader. Diba, parang we cannot expect the outlets to subscribe to all of the wire agencies kasi mahal naman on their end yun. So what we can do, yun nga, kay Nico din na, as readers, we try to diversify our sources. Kumbaga basahin natin, hindi lang sa isa, palagi sa isang outlet, but to consider if yung new ones, if you want to get the report, then to consider different outlets. Kasi if you see, iba-iba naman din yung pinanggagalingan ng wire agencies per outlet. So potentially there's diversity in the sources, but if we stick to one outlet, then we will not get that diversity. So that's a very important insight na while there may be constraints dun sa reporting setup, at mahirap naman baguhin talaga yon because diba, it's very strong economic decisions, tayo din as audience can do something about it. But thank you, Nico, talaga for the comments. Maganda siya, very comprehensive, and yun nga, hindi tayo antagonistic sa isa't isa.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Professor Paragas. Professor Correa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, so thank you, Professor Aljibe, for your comments. Yeah, I have certainly considered Netflix, the role of Netflix with regards to international audiences. and the role, because this show was also shown domestically in South Korea in TVN. It's a cable TV channel. So I also wanted to consider that, but okay. But for this afternoon's presentation, I decided to exclude it for the meantime. And just focus on the actual representations. But I do agree that Netflix has a role internationally, and that TVN as a cable TV network also has a role domestically when this was shown in South Korea. So yeah, I also agree with that point. Um, what else? Um, yeah, I haven't considered the political economy of Troy, but I think it is a good direction. So I will look into that. Thank you very much. Um, and yeah, in terms of visual codes, yeah, I was actually planning to uh, cite specific scenes, but in the end, for this presentation, I just decided to speak about Chloe as a whole. But yeah, in my notes, I do have some analysis of particular scenes. So yeah, but I guess in my final paper, it will be more, I hope it will be more clear. But yeah, I also agree with you on that point. Thank you very much. Um, and as for who really holds power and the ideological frames, I have been thinking about that, but I haven't really arrived at a particular answer yet. So I left it out for this presentation. But I'm glad that you noticed it. So yeah, it's something that I should pay attention to really. In terms of subject position, um, now that I think about it, I wasn't considering it while making this paper, but I think I was looking at Chloe as an international audience, Southeast Asian international audience with a Korean studies and a communication background. I think I was looking at it that way. Yeah, I think I have my work cut out for me for the final paper. And thank you very much. I really appreciate the comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Correa. Having said that, we'll now proceed to our question and answer. Sir Paragas, here is a question for you. Is it okay to use content discourse analysis in analyzing tweets of Filipinos about the Koreas? Will there be no ethical or privacy issues on this?
Okay, for us kasi the department has talked about it. Once the corpus is public, so halimbawa, especially for Twitter, ang messages, our Twitter feeds are public. So those are fair game, kumbaga. If someone posts the message publicly, then you can study it. Pag ang nagiging issue, if the account is protected and then you follow, and then yung ganun, kumbaga meron ng quasi-privacy measures in place, then you have to seek permission. So yun yung, kumbaga mayroon kami mga thresholds. If it's completely public, then it's fair game to be studied. Kung merong filters that you have to hurdle, then probably need to get explicit permission. But and then the bottom line is, especially for topics like this, that there may be potential harm, quote and unquote, we have to be mindful too. Iba pala, you're entering dangerous territory, then to be protective of your subjects and of yourself as well. So yun yung ethical concerns.
I see. Thank you, sir. I'm afraid this is another question for you. In many cases, photos appear in local media are pre-selected or those what are provided by the Korean media, for example, Yonhap News Agency. Given this, do you think there is any consideration that we readers should be critical to interpret visual images you have presented in the study?
Yeah, I think one of my objectives in this paper is to surface the workings nga of how international news is, how international news makes it to the papers. So for instance, in this case, we know that a lot of the images from North Korea come from Korean News Central Agency and then these are then distributed by the wire agencies. Para sabi ko, di ba, because it's a closed state, so very filtered na yon. So I mean, if we know that yung original source pa lang filtered na siya, di ba, kasama na yun sa pagiging critical natin. That what comes out of the north is already subject to heavy mediation by the north. And then may subsequent mediation by the south. So in this case, Seoul really is the dateline for almost all of the stories. So may filtering kumbaga na nangyayari. What the wire agencies in Seoul essentially permit to be distributed. May ganong kumbaga gatekeeping na nangyayari. So I think yung realization na ganito is important para pag nakita natin yung picture na ito, we can then react to it with this framework in mind.
See, well said, sir. This question is for Professor Correa. Even before Chloe gained huge popularity domestically in Korea and globally, Korea had produced many films touching North Korea-related issues in various genres, drama, thriller, comedy, and so on. So in this regard, how do you see if Chloe offered a pivotal role to bring out more dialogues in North and South Korean mass media? Professor Mitch?
Okay. In South Korean mass media, particularly news, the discussion about Chloe was more about how North Korean life is like, and also whether the portrayals are real or not. And in YouTube, a lot of North Korean YouTubers also made videos about their assessment on whether the scenes in Chloe are real or not. So I think more than dialogue, Chloe sparked curiosity. So more than dialogue, it's curiosity, I think, about North Korea, since it's a very closed country, and even their neighbors in South Korea don't know much about them. So there's curiosity. But I think after this initial curiosity, dialogue will eventually come. Yes, and so yeah, I think curiosity is a good starting point towards dialogue later on.
Yes, so it's a good starting point, right? Okay, so this question is for both of you. Now that we have some significant idea of the current modes of reporting and presentation, where do we go from here as Philippine consumers, audiences of Korea content? Sir
Mitch, you
Paragas?
want to answer first?
Okay. um, yeah, so now that you know about how certain things are represented in news and dramas and films, well, I think we should still continue enjoying watching these Korean dramas. But you know, the good thing about Korean contents is that they are not just entertaining, but since most of these uh, TV dramas and films are based on social issues, Korean social issues, history, culture, you can actually learn more about Korea through those kinds of media. Um, and through this, so beyond watching these media products, it's also a good chance to, the next step would be to learn more about your neighbors, not just through dramas and films, but through other means like by reading newspapers. And yeah, the point is to be more conscious about your neighbors, not just in the south, but in the north.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mitch. Sir Paragas?
So, ako naman, because we have a capitalist media model, and sabi nga, it's always a tension between giving what the audience needs and what the audience wants. But right now, because of the interactive nature of online media, every click counts. So kumbaga, if we really want additional content about Korea or about our Asian neighbors, then we have to read the news about them. Kasi doon, di ba, then makikita na may demand para sa news na ito, then there will be more news. Kumbaga spiraling of content. Kasi kung walang magbabasa ng what is offered, then eventually that kind of news will disappear. So kumbaga, we have to be more active as consumers that if we want some content to appear more, then we have to patronize more. Because for better or for worse, it's a capitalist media model that we now have. So we have to create the demand by reading the content. Parang ganun. Of course, kadugtong na doon yung nabanggit ko kanina about media literacy, that we have to be mindful that that the news we come across is the product of a particular model of journalism.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Here is another question for both of you. What are the key lessons from the ROK playbook in terms of use of soft power that the Philippines can learn from and should adopt in support of our national security interest? Any one of you can answer this question.
I'll answer about mahirap masyado yung national security, but soft power muna. Ang joke palagi, I organized a forum recently, and then the joke was ABS-CBN was our Ministry of Culture. then kasi, if sa Philippines, it produces yung what is essentially the dominant cultural content. And then dun sa export of content, ABS-CBN din, ang TFC, etc., etc. And then what happened, before it was, ABS-CBN was more active in selling Philippine soap opera, for instance, in various regions. Sa Africa, nakarating yung mga soap opera natin, but hindi nakabuo ng malaking pool. So hindi siya nakarating, it didn't reach the level of Hallyu because it's just one organization selling its products. Kumbaga, if we want really the model, the Korea model, it's an integrated effort, di ba? From across parang lahat ng industries, lahat ng cultural establishments working together to export their parang Korean quote-unquote products. Sa atin kasi is just one organization exporting, and then when that organization had a captive audience kasi maraming Filipinos abroad, marami ng subscribers, they are already earning from TFC, etc. The impetus to sell products outside of that main market dissipated kasi may captive market. So kung alisin natin yung captive market, kanino pa pwedeng benta quote-unquote ng products, at if it is a holistic effort, then we may have we may be able to use our soft power to then leverage it for the national security interest, which is happening now with Korea because we are so exposed to South Korean products, then dun mas kampi na tayo automatically sa kanila kasi sila yung mas kilala natin.
Yes. So, sir, you're trying to say that there should be more actors involved.
At saka more concerted effort.
Yes, I see.
Oo, na if we really want the Korean model, then we treat the products as exports, just like electronics or garment, kasi that's how they treated it.
Right. Professor Aljibe has something to say, ma'am.
If I may add, no, kasi I came from Star Cinema and ABS-CBN, so parang while I was still with them, I know the moves. Well, I've had several interviews about my K-drama analysis class, and I refuse to answer one question, and that is comparing the K-drama with the ABS-CBN teleseries. I think for me, that's a wrong question because they are being distributed not on the same platform. ABS at that time, we were on terrestrial television, and these K-dramas, they go streaming via Netflix. I'm talking about the local situation. And then I think the better question would be why ABS-CBN wasn't able to penetrate the international market as compared to what K-drama did. And I think one of the things that we also need to consider is that the Hallyu, they didn't start with the K-drama immediately. That wasn't the start. They had this K-pop, they had music first to offer to international and global audiences. While ABS teleseries didn't have that, no. May captive market na. Parang what I'm saying is that may captive market na ang Korean entertainment industry to start with, and I think they just added a new product. So it's like selling toothpaste and then you're offering now dental floss. It's something to that effect. Well, we have toothpaste right now, pero wala pa tayo sigurong dental floss. Something to that effect. And I think Professor Paragas is right by saying that we should treat this as an industry. And for us to have an industry, we should have a movement, not just ABS producing teleseries, but all the other networks should be doing the same thing. We should create a movement for an industry really to be push further towards globalization. Yun lang po.
Thank you, Professor Aljibe. Professor Correa, any thoughts?
Okay. So the goal of soft power really is to establish goodwill with other countries. So a country tries to make its culture attractive to its neighboring countries. And that's what Korea did to Hallyu. It made its culture very attractive to all of us. So I think that one key lesson that we can learn from the South Korean playbook in terms of soft power is to think about what parts of our culture can be attractive to international viewers. Like as Professor Paraga said, our dramas have had a captive audience in Africa. And some of my Southeast Asian friends from Vietnam and Laos also watch Filipino dramas. But you're right, it didn't quite get in the same kind of success or soft power that South Korea did. And I think it has something to do with which part of the content, which part of our culture will be more attractive to international viewers, which part of our culture um, uh, will make them like us as people. Yeah. So yeah, in terms of content, I think that's what we can learn from the South Korean playbook.
Okay, thank you, Professor Correa. This question actually is specifically addressed to Ma'am Amor, Professor Aljibe, actually, but Professor Paragas and Professor Correa and Ms. Dizon can also comment on this. Are there studies documenting and reanalyzing the same content, but its representation and interpretation have changed over time?
I cannot speak of one right now, but I'm sure there are a lot because, as what the cultural theories have claimed, meaning can never be fixed. It can never be final. The reading that I may be doing today for Chloe can change overnight. There can be another reading by tomorrow. What is fixed actually are codes, and these codes are made final through culture. But then even the cultural codes that we have can gradually change. So I think that's a good news for all of us who consume cultural products. There can never be just one reading. In fact, even with Chloe, if I will be applying different frameworks, I will read Chloe from using the lens of political economy. I can read it using the discursive approach of Foucault. I can read it by just using Stuart Hall's constructionist approach. I can read Chloe by just using semiotics by Barth. I can have 4 readings immediately, by applying these different frameworks. So meaning is produced really by us, by the people who consume, by the creators, by the authors. there can be several meanings. And the good news, as I mentioned earlier, is that there can not only be just one reading. The dominant or preferred reading usually would be really, there would be several efforts, if we have the ruling class, or, who's really making sense of our social, political system and the like. They will be pushing their own agenda by forcing us or instilling in us a preferred or dominant reading. But we can always have a negotiated, and we can always oppose what is being given to us. Otherwise, if we let all dominant readings, lead us, and make sense of the world by just having a uniform reading of a subject, then we make this world as hegemonic, we just let all media text to be defined as one, and I think that will not be very good for all of us. It will not be very critical about the products that we consume. Kanina, di ba, Dr. Paragas mentioned, if we support like a news organization that you think is more critical, then by all means, let's all do that. Parang let's give our support. Otherwise, kung meron tayong palaging isa lang na i-favor, siya lang yun talagang mananatili, and then and we will be consuming just one kind of cultural product.
Thank you, Professor Aljibe. I think Ms. Dizon has something to say on this. Ms. Dizon?
Actually, I don't. No, I didn't raise my hand or anything.
Oh, okay, it's all right. Okay, Professor Paragas, sir?
Actually, in terms of the content analysis, objective coding, we can do that, but I don't think we have longitudinal studies per se in the Philippines, in the social sciences. Wala pa talaga tayong discipline na gano'n that we have been tracking the same concepts across time. So if yun yung isa na pwede natin talang gagawin. At the Department of Communication Research, we're trying to develop this, but we're still in the early stages. But the fact is, we don't have a pool of social science data na consistent, especially sa communication and media area. So for instance, halimbawa ngayon, in my study, I have those variables and measures for the quantitative content analysis. I've started it this year, so maybe in a couple of years, I can test whether the sources have diversified for the wire agencies, whether Korean News, Korea Herald or Asian News Network now have a bigger share of news compared to Reuters and Agence France Presse. Pero honestly, right now, wala talaga.
I see.
That's the reality of it. We have the functional literacy and mass media survey, but yun na lang sabihin ko.
Okay, thank you, sir. To our dear audience, in as much as we love to entertain your questions in the interest of time, I'm afraid we have to finish our program here. And the UPKRC would like to thank everyone for coming. And also we would like to thank our speakers, Dr. Paragas, Professor Correa, Ms. Dizon, and Professor Aljibe for their insightful thoughts and discussions. So with that, we would like to thank everyone for being with us. And before we close this program, let me mention our upcoming event entitled Wading the Currents of Time, Hangul, the Writing System of Korean by Professor Mark D. Chavez of the Department of Linguistics. To our audience as well, we are issuing a certificate of participation for you only if you answer the evaluation form. The link will be open from 3 to 5 p.m. only. So those of you who wish to receive a certificate, please answer the form before 5 p.m. So for more information or updates, visit www.facebook.com/UPKRC. Use hashtag UPKRC 3PKC when posting in your SNS pages. With that, thank you everyone.